Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to this session on the Violence and Impacts Early Warning System views. My name is Angelica Lindquist McGowan, and I work as Operations and Manager at Uppsala University. If you change to the next slide. With me here today, I also have my colleague Simon, who's a senior researcher from Trio, and you will hear more from him during the Q&A. Next slide. So today I am hoping to provide you with a quick introduction to what views is, and also a little bit about the early warning system, specifically how we moved from the pilot model for Africa to the current operational system we're using today. We will go a little bit into the methodology, the kind of input data that informs our model, and a little bit about the forecast procedure. We will then look at some evaluations, specifically how we go about finding an appropriate evaluation metric and some results from that. And last but certainly not least, we will of course look at some of the data and services that we offer from views. Next slide. Thank you. So what is views then? Well, it is short for the Violence and Impacts Early Warning System, which is an academic research consortium between Uppsala University and Peace Research Institute Oslo. It brings together a suite of interrelated projects that study and predict the risk of political violence and its societal impacts. The common denominator for all of these projects is that they are led by the director of views. On this slide here, you can see a list of some of the projects that fall under this umbrella. Of course, we won't have time to talk about all of these today, but you can read more about them on our website, viewsforecasting.org. Next slide. Thank you. So Views started with an ERC Advanced grant back in 2017 to develop a pilot early warning system for predicting armed conflict in Africa, with the first prototype ready already the following year. Since 2018, we have been releasing monthly predictions of impending conflict across Africa for each month in a rolling 3-year window. Specifically, these have taken the form of predicted probabilities that would see at least 25 battle-related deaths in a given country and month, or at least one death in a given grid cell a month, with grid cells measuring about 55 square kilometers. The pilot model was limited to Africa between 2018 and 2020 and expanded to the Middle East with funding from UNESCO in 2021. Now, the views model has been developed iteratively throughout this time and has improved not only in terms of methodology and the data infrastructure that supports it, but also in terms of geographic coverage, target outcome to predict, and of course in predictive performance. That is how well our models actually predict the future. Next slide. So today we are working on the 5th iteration of our system. We currently offer predictions for the number of fatalities in impending conflict, as well as the dichotomous version of that. We're doing this using a brand new data infrastructure and a number of methodological advances. Most importantly, we have the Views 3 data infrastructure and database and a web-based client called User that interacts with our database and allows our users to extract the data needed to run our models locally, as well as to train new ones. We also make use of new input data and a number of new machine learning algorithms, and of course a new evaluation protocol, given this change from binary conflict predictions to a continuous prediction outcome. The new model also offers a broader geographic scope, moving to global coverage at the country level and Africa and the Middle East at the grid level. The downside of the new model at this point in time is that it's currently limited to state-based conflict, but it's set to expand to non-state on one side also in the near future. Next slide. So why did we make this change? Well, most importantly, moving to a continuous prediction target means that we avoid some of the arbitrary cutoffs, like 25 battle-related deaths or 1 per month. It allows a more nuanced handling of uncertainty, a better use of available information, and a better representation of the total impact of armed conflict, which has allowed us to also look into conflict impacts and how that affects humanitarian outcomes, which we're doing through two new research projects. And perhaps most important for practitioners, this allows a more straightforward customization of the output. For example, making per capita estimates or aggregating our predictions to new levels of analysis, like the admin 1 or admin 2 levels that I know many of you use. The downside here is that modeling is a bit more complicated and evaluation of the models is a little bit less straightforward, but we'll go into that more later. Next. So what data is our model trained on then? Well, we use an extensive suite of open source input data variables covering the years from 1990 onwards. All of these are carefully selected based on decades of peace and conflict research and drawn directly from the data provider or created by means of some form of processing or transformation of the data in-house here at Views. We also make use of systematic data collection, meaning that we use clear, concise, and immutable definitions and have uniform coverage across time and space. And of course, the data itself is updated at least annually with conflict and media data monthly. Next slide. One of the most important predictors that we use, as well as the type of outcome that our model is trained to predict, is organized political violence as defined and recorded by the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, UCDP. So for the years 1990 to 2021, we make use of the UCDP GED datasets, which has an annual update schedule. And for January 2022 onwards, we use the UCDP candidate dataset, which is released on a monthly update schedule, and then is replaced by the get released once a year. Next slide. Some of the other themes beyond conflict history are, for example, development indices such as GDP per capita, infant mortality rates, or democracy indices and measures of political stability from VDEM, such as liberal democracy, rule of law, equality, exclusion of social groups, and politics. Next. We also have some climate and societal vulnerability indicators, such as food prices, access to clean water, climate extreme indices, precipitation, and so forth. We have some natural and geography features from PreGrid that covers things like terrain type, proximity to cities and country borders, and other demographic factors. And last, we make use of the conflict forecast model with the content analysis of news media. Next. So how does the model work then? Well, we use these data on similar themes and group these together into what we call predictors, or sets of predictors, feature sets. These feature sets are then combined with an advanced machine learning algorithm and become what we call submodels. These submodels are again in the next step combined into ensembles that are updated monthly. And at the country level, we use a genetic algorithm to determine the weight of the different submodels informing the ensemble. The result is what you can see here on the slide on the right. I know it's a little difficult to see the text, but essentially the darker the color, the greater the weight that this specific submodel has in the ensemble. And what you see on the x-axis here is the different steps in time, so 1 to 36 months into the future. Next slide. Here, I just wanted to add a quick illustration of how the model reacts when there is an escalation of conflict. Once we click on this in a few seconds, you'll see that the line here will update, which is the predictions over time based on the input data that was available at the single moment in time. You'll also see some vertical bars that represent the conflict data that was recorded during a single month. So if you could click on that. No, on the plots. All right, that doesn't seem to be working. I will upload this on our website later and you can have a look. But essentially, you will see that as we get more conflict data and run escalation of conflict data, the lines also increase. You can see an escalation of our conflict predictions. Next slide. So another question, of course, that we often get is how well the models perform, or like how we succeed in predicting impending conflicts. Equally common is that we get a request for a simple metric or a plot to illustrate this result, but this is a rather complex question to answer. And the reason for this is that predictive performance is entirely dependent on how you define or what you define as a good prediction, and as such, which metric you choose to assess that type of prediction. The figure here offers a simple illustration of this problem using an example from the prediction competition that we hosted back in 2020. Each node on these little diagrams reflect the performance on one specific metric. So as you can see, the single model can perform really well on one metric and very poorly on another. Needless to say, we don't have time to go into the specifics of all of these discussions today, but you can find more information about our thoughts on this in the technical papers and articles on our website, and in the special issue showcasing the results from this competition, also linked on our website. But for today, I just wanted to show 2 quick examples using one of our main metrics, which is mean squared error, or MSE, which is the square of the difference between what we predicted and what actually happened. Next slide. So here we see an example using a subset of forecasts for 2017 to 2020 from our first fatalities model. And we can see here that if we're looking 3 months into the future, we get an MSE score of about 0.4, which means that about 2/3 of our predictions are between 55 and 180% of actual. And if we're looking 36 months into time, we see that about 2/3 of the predictions are between 40 and 250% of actual. What this means is that the predictive performance or skill of our models slowly decline the further into the future that we look, similar to what we've heard from other prediction teams earlier this week. But you can read more about the evaluation that these 2 brief examples come from in the Forecasting Fatalities report linked on the slide here and also available on our website. We also have a systematic evaluation ongoing on the newest model as well that we hope to release soon. Next slide. So what do we offer then? Well, we have a range of different data sets available. Most importantly, we offer conflict predictions for a rolling window of 3 years, so each month over the next 1 to 36 months. We offer dichotomous, that is the no conflict predictions from the pilot models from 2018 to 2021, and the continuous or number of fatalities predictions coupled with a dichotomous version of that from 2022 onwards. Along with these data sets, we also offer some surrogate model results, which is an interpretation tool we've been working on, where we're trying to illustrate what the key drivers between different forecasts are. We've also started releasing an input data sets where we show some of the key drivers or the key input data that informs our models on a monthly basis. Next slide. All of these data sets are available for immediate access via the Views API. You also have some guide and helper tools in the GitHub repository connected to the API. You can also explore all of our data via the interactive Views data dashboard. Right now, it's unfortunately limited to the old dichotomous model, but we have a consultant working on it as we speak and hope that we will be able to release a new version within about a month's time. You'll then be able to see all of our forecasts, some analysis of the key drivers from these surrogate models, some of the input data, and a simple evaluation of our predictions for each month as soon as we get more data on the actual reported fatalities. Soon you will also be able to download both current and historic data sets in a more user-friendly format, just for download via some online repositories. Next slide. For those of you who are more interested in running these models or setting up a local instance of them, you can also access the complete model documentation and tools to run our models via a set of GitHub repositories. We have the web-based client Views here that I mentioned earlier that interacts with our database, and you also have public code base and model documentation in the Views forecasting repository. Next slide. So why are we doing all of this? Well, we believe that data-driven systems like our own has a vast potential as an objective and transparent source of data to support decision-making. We believe that they specifically can help identify blind spots and systematically identify areas at risks and the intensity thereof, in our case, up to 3 years ahead. We also believe that this can facilitate anticipatory action and allocation of resources where most direly needed. But if we move to the last slide, there are, of course, always some limitations that are important to keep in mind. And in case of data-driven models, use just being one of them, any model can only be as good as the data informs it, which compounds the inherent uncertainties in model design. So it's important to see the predictions that are generated from these models as indications of general trends or early warning of impending crisis rather than as guarantees of what will happen. That also makes them ideal to use in combination with, for example, qualitative experts' assessments or other data sources. Thank you. That was all for me. Thank you very much for listening. And I hope to open up the floor now for some questions and bring in my colleague Simon, who's sitting here eagerly waiting for some questions to answer. Thank you very much for listening in. So we have a question now in the chat asking if the data sets we're using for gridded prediction only comes from pre-grid, or if we have looked at using more complex geospatial data sources. No, it's not only from pre-grid. We use a lot of different data sets that we aggregate to the pre-grid level of analysis, which is our synaptional level. But we do use a lot of the natural and social geography data from pre-grid, from the data they make available.
Just to add to that, as the person who asks the question might also know, many of the variables in the pre-grid are rather static, either by nature, because it is very structurable variables, or by the way they're measured with different intervals and updated. So it's paramount that we use, as Angela says, other data sources, because otherwise our predictions would be overly static.
Any other questions, or was everything crystal clear? Well, if there aren't any more questions right now, maybe I'll turn to Simon myself and ask if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on some of the stuff that we have ongoing right now on the methodological side. I know that there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there.
Yes, there is. So of course It's like we're always working in two paces because we are an academic team that are doing a lot of research and development, but of course we can't put any of our new stuff out into actual production before we are adamant that it is doing what we suspect it is doing, right? So what we currently have in production is what we think is very well validated, and that we have a lot of confidence in doing that it is doing what we think it is doing, what we know it is doing. So that's nice. But we do have a lot of other stuff in the pipeline that we hope to be releasing slowly. So we have models, of course, that does all three kind of violence. They're running just fine. We just need time to validate it and put it in to the pipeline. But more interesting is probably something that is most in the forefront of our pipeline right now is predicting with uncertainties. So right now, what you get through our API is point estimates of fatalities, whether or not it's on country level or pre-grid level. You get one probability or you get one fatality count. And we are trying to change that to distributions. And exactly how that is going to look is still a bit up the air, but it could look something like, instead of having one point estimate, you would have a vector on array of 1,000 estimates that together constitute a sample of predictions, where you will of course have the lion's share of the probability mass around what is right now the point estimate, but you will also be better able to assess the tail distribution, which would make our predictions better suited if you want to see what is the probability of a high impact but low probability event, right? Because that's arguably just as important as looking at, what do we think is most likely. It's also nice to know, well, what do we think might be unlikely but could be extremely impactful and severe. And estimating with uncertainty is gonna improve the way we can do this a lot. We were just, as I mentioned earlier this week, last week we were in Berlin working on this with the German Foreign Office and Preview and a number of academics from around the world. So that was extremely interesting, and we're working more towards that. So that is one of the kind of the next big things we are going to put into our production pipeline, this uncertainty measure. Then right now we are using state-of-the-art models and ensembles of state-of-the-art models for these predictions, but the models we use are still kind of generic in the sense that it is XGBoost and stuff like that. That is very well suited for tabular data, and it does its job, but we are experimenting with a lot of new models, or not a lot, but a couple of new models in our pipeline that is specifically tailored towards the kind of data we are working with and the data generating processes behind this. So that's super exciting. These models are running and working, but again, we need validation and we need to make sure that they go into the pipeline in a responsible and neat manner. But that is going to be super interesting. Then, of course, which I also mentioned earlier this week, we are slowly but surely doing more and more work on structured data. As Angelica mentioned, we are using text data to a certain extent, given the fact that we use the forecasting.org predictions, and Hannes Müller and his team, who is behind that framework, uses text data from Fictiva. And we will be continuing our collaboration with them for sure. They are, close partners of it all, and part of the Views consortium. But we are also working at in-house text models right now, so that's going to be interesting. Another extreme that I actually just forgot here, but remember, another very extreme, very interesting new development is the fact that we know, as was also mentioned earlier, that this week, that the UCDP data, the conflict fatalities, we know that these fatalities are, their measurement errors and biases, and we have a number of relatively sound idea in regards to the directions of these measurement errors and biases, which also means that not only can we correct them, we can also, or we are working on putting a probability distributions around these estimates. So this is not just, we don't just want to have our model to produce estimates with uncertainty. We also want the data that we put into our model to accurately represent how uncertain we are in regards to the input data. Because right now, our model takes the UCDP data as truth. And we know it's not. We know it has biases towards urban area and large population centers and stuff like that. So combining this, both having data that accurately represents the uncertainty and models that take both this data uncertainty into account and modeling uncertainty into account is extremely exciting. So we really looking forward to that.
Not to throw the ball right back in your court, Simon, but we also got a question on the geospatial data processing pipeline.
Yes.
What that looks like.
I am unsure exactly what is meant here, but I can try to say what I maybe think is asked about here. Otherwise, just feel free to elaborate if I am going if I'm beginning to talk about something you are not interested in at all. So, given the fact that the models in the pipeline right now are large tabular data supervised machine learning models, we take into account time and space in two different ways. First of all, there is a lot of lags and leads and different decay functions, which that's simply feature engineering, right? Taking different kind of features that we expect on a theoretically or empirically tested ground that these need to be lagged or put into the decay function, and then we just do what some would now consider old school feature engineering, as was part of the original pilot project, right? We are for the tabular data part, we are making more and more advanced lags and decay functions, but it is still, and convolutions and stuff like that, but it is still the way we do it. And for these big tabular data supervised models, the way that they kind of propagate their results into the future, both for time and space, is that we shift the target. So we have models that estimate 1 month into the future, 2 months into the future, 3 months into the future. And that was, Angelica showed a plot showing which kind of features were most important for different steps out into the future. That is kind of in a nutshell how geospatial patterns and temporal patterns are estimated for the models that are in production right now, in the production pipeline. For the models that we are still working on, these use different kind of neural networks to estimate the geotemporal, the temporal spatial patterns of conflict and other developments, which is super interesting. We use all kind of neural network tricks for this, convolutional neural networks, recurrent neural networks, LSTM neural networks, and the idea here is that we can kind of shelve a lot of the researcher assumptions and a lot of the researcher hours that goes into making feature engineering with lags and decay functions and like hard-coded convolution and stuff like that. So that is something I am myself working on. So I think that is super exciting. So this will create more flexible models that are able to pick up more complex signals. So that's exciting. I don't know if I answered your question, but I hope that was at least somewhat interesting. So I'm just going to take the Alexandra question first and then the Rob, if that's okay.
We have one on ethical.
I don't know. I will skip the Alexandra question because I think maybe Angelica, you know more about that than me, and then I will just answer the Rob question, and then you can see if you have anything to add to the Alexandra question because I actually don't know. Um, Again, we are starting to become quite a large team, so we can have kind of eyes on everything. Yes, we are experimenting, and 2 weeks ago I had a very unsuccessful experiment with spatial transformers, but I will get back on that horse again. We are definitely also going to experiment more with attention network and transformers in that capacity. Some of the things that we are currently using LSTMs for behind the scene in our kind of development part of it, that should be changed to attention networks and transformers at some point. The nice thing about right now using LSTM networks and recurrent networks is that they are rather cheap to run, comparatively, so at least. But of course, they also have some inherent kind of assumptions built into them in regards to how things move throughout time, for instance. Not to get too technical about this, but when you use recurrent neural networks and to a lesser extent, but still LSTM neural networks, you are kind of assuming that things get less important the further you move away from them in time. And that is not an unreasonable assumption, but it could well be argued that like huge cultural events, like collective traumas, genocide, stuff like that, that these things could lay dormant and then suddenly be used to mobilize people many years into the future. Attention networks and transformers would be able to learn that these things can have, immense impact far away from the original kind of event. Uh, Recurrent network, and again to a lesser extent LSTM networks, have a bit of a harder time accepting that something that happened a very long time ago can still be of immense impact given the right circumstances. So yes, definitely transformers, attention networks. There were 2 presentations in Berlin. One presentation were from Sonia and Julia, that is in the Armed Defense University in Munich, and I forget the other 2 contributors. That's embarrassing now, but they were also 2. I think they were from a technical university in Germany. If you are interested, I will definitely find their name. They deserve to be mentioned. So we had contributions in Berlin that use transformers and attention, and we are definitely going forward with that for sure.
Thanks, Simon. So I can jump in on the question on combining models with qualitative expert analysis. So what I was referring to here is mostly using both the kind of data-driven models that use offer, but also expert assessments, as I know is already done within a big portion of the UN system. Basically, just having country experts available that can answer and analyze the conflict. I'm not finding the words right now, conflict situations at a more in-depth level. Of course, we can get a lot of really interesting data and quite precise predictions sometimes from data-driven models, but the kind of nuance and in-depth understanding of exactly what's happening on the ground is really difficult to replace. So by combining use of predictive models to get this sort of systematic overview and make sure that we don't miss any locations that are in dire need of help, but maybe doesn't show up as much in media or doesn't get discussed as much and therefore become blind spots, I think is very useful. But also having some traditional experts that can add a little bit more information to the situation. And we have actually been experimenting a little bit with this in Views as well. For a few years, we've been running an expert survey project. Now this is a bit backlogged. We haven't gotten the results out yet. We're working on that as we speak. But we conducted an expert survey over 2019 till the end of 2021, where we asked traditional country experts to answer a survey every 3 months on the conflict issues in their specific countries of expertise, and then track these issues over time to try and capture how the issues changed, what the stakeholders affiliated with these issues thought on them and how their positions changed over time. We also got some information on demands and threats affiliated with these conflict issues, and then some explicit predictions as well for the future that we're now trying to compare with our own predictions and see whether we can combine the two or feed this qualitative information into our quantitative models. The results are still being developed as we speak, but we hope to be releasing this soon, so we'll be able to get back to that more then. I also saw a question on ethical consideration that kind of feeds into this a little bit. I know that one of the things that make people a bit skeptical when it comes to data-driven models is that it, of course, can be perceived a little bit distant from the reality or distant from what's happening on the ground. And that's also why it's very interesting to be able to bring in these kind of expert analysis. Also, the model that we're using from the conflict forecast team with text-based learning is a good complement to this, where we can capture what is happening or what is being spoken about in news media as well as in social media for many other models, and try and capture what's happening on the ground and get more voices into this discussion rather than just the purely numerical data that we're predominantly using for our models.
Can I add some consideration to the ethical thing from a totally different angle? It is just, I want to share this because I think a lot about a specific kind of weird situation we find ourselves in that we also discussed in Berlin. That so it is no secret in this community that some of the most important predictors we have are conflict history, and that's fair and that's nice. There's a lot of reasons for that that I won't go into that, but we have pretty good idea of why this is. But something that sometimes like raises a question for me is that I can for some of the models that I'm developing, I can decide how kind of imaginative they can be going into the future, or how conservative they should be going into the future. And that creates a bit of a weird dilemma, because usually the most historically conservative models are also the models that perform best on the current metrics we are using. And I say current because we have new metrics in development that is going to hopefully alleviate this issue. So that's very important. But with the current metrics, they kind of tend to reward the historically conservative models. Then I have models that are more kind of imaginative, as I said, and they get penalized. But it's a good question whether or not that could be considered kind of not a big ethical issue, but at least, enough to raise an ethical consideration that if our best models kind of end up feeding back into a conflict trap mechanism, because some people could be reading our forecast and they could say, all right, so we just have these areas and they just keep being, impacted by conflict, and so we don't want to touch that. We would like to have models that are more dynamic, that are taking more chance, and that's also going to be here when we have distributions, of course. But it is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and very much looking forward to having better metrics to kind of help us assess these things, because of course we don't want to end up with models that are overly historically conservative. We want models that that actually kind of are useful and informative beyond just saying that, all right, this is past conflict patterns just extrapolated into the future. So yes, that's at least something I'm thinking a lot about.
I think we are a little bit over time, so unless there are any final quick questions, I just want to say thank you for everyone for tuning in today. And if you want to learn more about Views or our ongoing work, please don't hesitate to reach out. You have some contact details in the slides. You can also find everything on our website, and I'll post the slides on the website as well, so you can access everything there. Thank you so much for listening in.